Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a fascinating contradiction hidden right inside the 2025 global energy and transport data. If you follow energy markets, you probably think you know the story, right? Renewables get cheaper every year, adoption goes up, and the world slowly greens its grid. But the data from this past year, it just threw a massive wrench into that predictable narrative. We're seeing a profound divergence, a split in the road, where some crucial technologies are suddenly moving in the exact opposite direction of what everyone expected. It's a giant puzzle, and by the end of this explainer, you're going to see exactly how the cars we drive are secretly rewriting the rules of the whole global power grid. So let's dive right into this totally counterintuitive reality. Is the clean energy transition actually getting more expensive? Now, for the last decade, the answer has been a resounding no. I mean, we've been completely spoiled by a steady, predictable downward slope in the cost of green tech. But in 2025, the answer, shockingly, was yes. According to a landmark report from Bloomberg NEF, building most new clean energy generation actually got pricier. All of those massive solar farms and towering wind turbines that we rely on to push fossil fuels out of the market suddenly hit a serious cost hurdle. It's the kind of macroeconomic plot twist that makes you sit up and pay attention. When you look at the 2025 global benchmark costs, the contrast is stark. Solar project costs increased by 6%, and onshore wind crept up by 2%. And traditional thermal power took an even bigger hit, with combined cycle gas turbines skyrocketing by a staggering 16%. That hits the highest level on record. So why is this happening? Well, it's basically a perfect storm. We've got global supply chain constraints, rising protectionism, and even poorer wind resource availability in some key regions. But there is another massive factor here: data centers. The whole artificial intelligence boom is demanding so much electricity that it's keeping gas turbine demand artificially elevated. But among all these rising costs, there is one lone, incredibly exciting exception, and that's battery storage. While literally everything else got more expensive, batteries just fell off a cliff. To really understand the squeeze we're seeing, we need to look at the human side of this macroeconomic data. Amar Vazdev, a senior energy economics associate at Bloomberg NEF, sums it up perfectly. He notes that we're in the middle of a race for electrons. And you know, that phrasing captures the exact reality on the ground: a race for electrons. Between the rapid electrification of our vehicles and homes and the explosive growth of these massive power-hungry AI data centers, traditional and renewable power markets are stretched incredibly thin right now. Everyone wants power and they want it now, which is exactly what drove those generation and equipment costs up globally. Section 1, the twist. Batteries hit record lows. Okay, so while generation costs were getting squeezed by this race for electrons, the cost to actually store that power completely plummeted. Anchor yourself on this number: $78. In 2025, the global benchmark cost for a 4-hour battery storage project fell to just $78 per megawatt hour. That's a massive 27% drop in a single year, and it represents a record low since Bloomberg NEF began tracking these costs way back in 2009. We're talking about the kind of price point that fundamentally transforms the economics of the power grid. It means developers can now pair cheap batteries with solar farms and effectively provide firm, flexible power that undercuts fossil fuel peaking plants. But the big question is, how on earth did batteries defy the global inflation that hit everything else? 17 million. That right there is the catalyst. That's the staggeringly massive number of electric vehicles sold globally in the year 2024. Representing more than 20% of all car sales worldwide. To put that into perspective, just the additional 3.5 million electric cars sold in 2024 compared to the previous year, that alone is more than the total number of electric cars sold worldwide in the entirety of 2020. It is an absolute explosion in consumer demand, and it's the secret engine driving those grid battery prices down. As the global EV market expanded, manufacturers got locked into this fierce arms race to build gigafactories capable of churning out millions of lithium-ion cells. But the fascinating economic twist here is that they actually built too much capacity. This manufacturing overcapacity from the booming electric vehicle market created an absolute glut of batteries. When you have intense competition among manufacturers and factories that can produce way more batteries than the car market can instantly absorb, well, prices plummet. And those ultra-cheap batteries spill directly over into the energy sector, allowing power companies to buy up grid-scale storage for a fraction of what it used to cost. Seriously, the car market is practically subsidizing the clean energy grid. Section 2, the global EV boom and China's dominance. Now that we know EVs are driving the battery revolution, we have to map out exactly where these 17 million vehicle sales are actually happening. Because, well, this isn't exactly a uniform global transition. The data shows a heavily tilted playing field. China accounts for nearly 50% of all global EV sales. Over 11 million electric cars were sold in China last year alone. That means the number of EVs sold in China in a single year was more than global sales just 2 years prior. Because of this sustained aggressive growth, an astonishing 1 in 10 cars driving on Chinese roads today is fully electric. The US and Europe are in the mix, sure, holding on to roughly 20% sales shares in their respective markets. But China is just operating on an entirely different level of scale. So why this stark difference in adoption rates? Honestly, it all comes down to the affordability gap. In the United States and Europe, if you want to buy an EV, you're still facing a 20% to 30% price premium compared to a standard gas car. It's still seen by many as a luxury choice. But in China, 2/3 of all electric cars sold are actually cheaper than their gas-powered counterparts. I mean, let that sink in for a second. You don't even need a government subsidy for the math to make sense anymore. This is largely because battery pack prices in China plunged by 30% recently, compared to just a 10 to 15% drop in the West. China has integrated its supply chains and maximized manufacturing efficiency so well that they've essentially eliminated the green premium for the average consumer. And that manufacturing dominance is starting to spill over borders, creating entirely new centers of growth. In 2024, EV sales in Latin America jumped by over 60%, largely driven by Brazil, where sales more than doubled. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, sales grew by nearly 50%, with heavy adoption in places like Thailand and Vietnam. These emerging economies are bypassing the slow, heavily subsidized adoption curves that we saw in the West over the last decade. And they're doing it because the vehicles have suddenly become incredibly affordable. To put a really fine point on it, Chinese imports account for a staggering 85% of electric car sales in both Brazil and Thailand. 85%. Across all emerging economies outside of China, Chinese imports made up 75% of the total increase in electric car sales in 2024. What we're witnessing here is the cheap battery completely reshaping global trade flows. Because Chinese automakers can produce high-quality EVs at a price point that dramatically undercuts legacy automakers, they're rapidly exporting their overcapacity to eager emerging markets, effectively rewriting the global automotive hierarchy in real time.
Section 3. The Road to 2030.
So we've established the current reality: soaring generation costs, plummeting battery prices, and an EV market dominated by Chinese manufacturing scale. Looking ahead, the next few years will largely be about tomorrow's infrastructure frantically trying to catch up to today's EV boom. Public charging stations have doubled in the past 2 years, but in a lot of Western markets, charger build-out is still severely lagging behind vehicle adoption. As battery costs continue to crash, ensuring that the charging ecosystem is as frictionless as filling up at a gas station is going to be the defining logistical challenge of the late 2020s. If we manage that infrastructure scale-up, the 2030 projections are nothing short of revolutionary. The IEA projects that global EV market share will exceed 40%. In China, that number is expected to hit around 80%. But the metric that truly changes the world is this: 5 million barrels of oil displaced daily. Every single day, 5 million barrels of oil that would have been pumped, refined, and burned will simply stay in the ground or be redirected elsewhere, strictly because of electric mobility. Half of those global savings will come from China alone. That's obviously an immense win for environmental targets, but arguably it's an even bigger story about global energy security and macroeconomics. Which brings us to our final provocative thought. We started out by looking at how the cost of clean energy generation briefly rose, while the cost of batteries crashed to record lows thanks to a global EV boom. Now, looking at the entire board, with shifting global trade flows, localized supply chains, and millions of barrels of oil being displaced, who's going to dominate the next era of energy independence? Will it be the legacy powers adapting to new tech, or will the countries that mastered the cheap battery completely rewrite the world order? It's a fascinating question, and for sure one we'll continue to track closely. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep your eyes on the data, because the future is arriving way faster than we think.